By 1891, there were still mills running in the Saginaw Valley in Michigan, but what they were cutting was not what they had been cutting 20 years earlier. The foreman on a mill of that period was the man everything passed through. He set the log on the carriage, decided how to turn it, and he was the first to see what was inside. The work was loud and dangerous, steam drive, a band blade taller than a man, the log fed on at a speed where a mistake costs a hand, and a foreman was valued for one thing. He read a log before it reached the blade. And here is what a foreman of that generation was seeing on the end of nearly every log through the 80s. The rings ran fine, not 10 to the inch, not 20, 40, 50, in places pushing 60, thin as a hair, and to count them you had to lean in close and put the light across at an angle. That pattern means exactly one thing, and any man in a mill understood it without an education. The tree grew slowly, in shade, under a closed canopy, hemmed in by its neighbours, putting on a fraction of a millimetre a year. A log 4 feet across made of rings like that is 200 years old, sometimes 300, sometimes older than the country it is being cut in. And 20 miles from that mill, on ground logged 15 years before, young pine was coming up in the open, in full sun, with nothing to compete against, and its rings ran 8 or 10 to the inch, wide, soft, coarse. Same species, same soil, same climate, a different tree. And a foreman looking at those two log ends side by side knew what the industry would not admit on the record for another generation. What they were cutting does not grow back. Not because pine will not seed, but because a board with 40 rings to the inch takes 2 centuries of canopy, and the canopy is precisely what they were floating downriver. In 1888, Michigan cut its record volume and went down from there, and almost nobody at the time called that the end. They called it a poor season. But the figure that told you the whole thing in advance was not in any state statistician's report. It was on the end of every log. Anyone who leaned in could count it, and I will give it to you in block 7. For now hold 2 numbers side by side, 40 rings to the inch and 8. You have to know what was standing there, because the modern eye has nothing to compare it to. The white pine forest of the Great Lakes ran across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, and it was the largest body of merchantable softwood on the continent. A mature tree stood 150 feet and better, 3 to 5 feet through at the butt, and the first branch might be 70 feet off the ground, because in a closed forest a pine puts everything into height, races its neighbours for the light, and sheds its lower limbs as they are shaded out. That is what makes the timber. No lower branches means no knots, and clear, knot-free lumber with 50 rings to the inch is dimensionally stable, works easily, holds paint, does not warp, and floats high enough to drive down a river. There has never been a better structural softwood available in quantity anywhere. It built Chicago twice, once before the fire and again after it, and it built the barns, churches, schools and houses of most of the middle of the country, and there is not a stand of it left today that anybody is cutting. The stands were also not what people picture. This was not thicket. Under a closed old-growth canopy the crowns take the light, and the floor below is open, shaded, quiet, thin with undergrowth. Men who walked into it before the cutting described riding a horse through it at a trot. It had been assembling itself since the ice left, roughly 10,000 years, and the trees standing in 1850 had been individually alive for 2 to 4 centuries of that. Then it was removed in about 50 years, not thinned, removed, from Saginaw west across Michigan, across Wisconsin, into Minnesota, ahead of the mills and behind the railroads, and by the time anyone with authority said the word conservation out loud, it was effectively finished. Subscribe now, because the interesting question is not how they cut it that fast. It is whether anyone in the mills could see it coming, and the answer is on the log ends. The mechanism is simple, and it is worth having exactly right, because everything after this depends on it. In spring, when water is available and the growing season opens, a conifer lays down large, thin-walled cells, early wood, pale and soft. Later in the season, as growth slows toward dormancy, it lays down small, thick-walled cells, late wood, dense and dark. One pale band and one dark band together are 1 year. Count them and you have the age, and the count is not approximate, it is exact, to the year, on any sound piece of conifer. But the width of that pair is not fixed. It is a record of the conditions the tree lived through, and the dominant condition in a closed forest is not rainfall, it is light. A seedling under a full canopy gets almost nothing, a few % of the light falling on the crowns above it. It can sit in the understory for decades, barely moving, laying down rings so tight you cannot separate them with the naked eye, waiting for a neighbour to fall and open a gap. Then it releases, and the rings widen. Foresters call it suppression and release, and it means a cross-section is not just an age, it is a biography. This many decades in shade, a gap opening here, a good run there. Read enough of them from one district and you can reconstruct which winters were hard, which years the fires ran, and when the big neighbours came down, because every tree in earshot recorded the same events in its own wood. Now take that to the mill floor in 1891. Fine rings do not merely indicate an old tree, they indicate a tree that grew inside a forest that was already old when that tree started, because slow growth requires a canopy above it, and a canopy is a structure that takes centuries to assemble. That is the part with teeth in it. The rings were not recording the age of the log, they were recording the age of the forest, and the forest was the one thing the industry was not cutting down and replacing, it was cutting it down and leaving. The scale is difficult to hold in your head, so take one place. Saginaw and Bay City sat at the mouth of a river system, draining an enormous pine district, and at the peak there were on the order of 100 mills operating along that river, one after another, on both banks, sawing day and night in season. Downriver at Muskegon, on Lake Michigan, 40-odd mills ran at once. This was the largest concentration of sawmilling on Earth at the time, and the technology moved fast. The muley and the sash saw gave way to the circular to the bandsaw in the 80s, and a band blade wastes less wood in the kerf and cuts faster, so every mill that installed one raised its own capacity and lowered the price. Which is worth sitting with for a second. Every improvement in the machinery shortened the life of the resource, and every mill owner who declined to improve went under first. The logs arrived by water. Winter crews felled and skidded on iced roads to the riverbank and decked the logs on the ice. The spring drive brought the whole winter's cut down on high water. At the mouth, a booming company sorted a mixed drive of hundreds of thousands of logs by the mark stamped into each end, registered like a cattle brand, and delivered every one to the mill that owned it. Michigan's total run of white pine over that period is usually put at something over 160 billion board feet. The Saginaw Valley alone accounts for tens of billions of it. And a foreman standing at the carriage saw every one of those logs pass at close range, with its rings showing. Nobody on the continent had a better sample. A doctor sees a few thousand patients in a career. A foreman on a Saginaw mill saw a few thousand old-growth log ends in a season, at arm's length, in good light, with the grain freshly cut and wet, and every ring standing out sharp. Which raises the obvious question: and it is the one the whole video turns on. If the evidence was on every log, why did it take until the 20th century for any one official to say so out loud? Because saying it was somebody's job, and that job did not exist yet, and because the men who could see it had every reason not to. Start with the plainest one. A mill foreman was an employee. What he knew standing at a machine, and there was no channel out of that room that led anywhere. He did not publish, he was not consulted, and the owner was not asking him for a long-range view of the resource. There was no professional society for him to write to, no trade journal that took letters from the mill floor as evidence, and no forestry school in the United States at all until 1898. Then take the owners, and this is where it becomes uncomfortable rather than villainous. They were not fools, and many of them knew perfectly well the pine was finite. Their response was rational inside the rules they were operating under. Cut it out here, take the capital west, buy stumpage in Wisconsin, then in Minnesota, then in the South and on the Pacific coast. A forest was not an asset you managed, it was an inventory you liquidated, and the man who cut slowly simply lost the ground to the man who cut fast. Nothing in the law, the tax code, or the market rewarded restraint, and quite a lot punished it. And then the third layer, which people forget, the American doctrine of inexhaustibility. For most of the 19th century, the sincere and near-universal belief was that the forests of this continent could not be used up. The country was too big, the timber too vast, and to suggest otherwise was to sound faintly ridiculous. Against a belief that broad, a man leaning over a log end counting rings has no standing at all. He is not producing evidence, he is producing an opinion, from the wrong end of the mill, about a thing everybody already knows. And that stayed true right up until somebody with a title started counting the same rings and writing the numbers down. There were a few, and they were early, and they were mostly ignored. In 1867, the state of Wisconsin commissioned a report on the disastrous effects of forest destruction, and Increase Lapham and his colleagues delivered it, and it laid out the consequences plainly: soil, water, climate, the exhaustion of the supply. It was published, the legislature received it, and it went essentially nowhere. No law followed it, and the cutting through the 70s and 80s ran heavier than anything that came before. In 1875, a group of them founded the American Forestry Association. In 1876, the federal government appointed Franklin Hough as a special agent to study the forest situation, which is the thin thread that eventually becomes the Forest Service. Meanwhile, in Michigan, a state forestry commission was collecting production figures mill by mill and river by river, and by the late 80s the totals were doing something that no amount of optimism could talk around. 1888 was the peak, and after it the annual cut fell, and kept falling, not because demand dropped, but because there was less to cut. The paper trail is remarkable when you go and look at it. The men who ran this industry, the men who studied it, and the men who worked in it were all in possession of the relevant facts before 1890. What did not exist was any mechanism through which knowing it changed anything. Bernhard Furneaux was already running the Federal Forestry Division. Gifford Pinchot came back from Europe trained in exactly this discipline, because there was nowhere at home to learn it, and in 1892 he began managing the forest at Biltmore in North Carolina on a working plan, the first anywhere in the country. The knowledge arrived on time. It was the institutions that were late. The Forest Service as such does not exist until 1905. The national forests take shape around the same time, and by then the thing they were built to manage had already gone east on rail cars as lumber. Which brings me to the number. 200 years. That is what a board with 40 rings to the inch is telling you, at minimum, in the plainest possible terms, 40 rings is 40 years in 1 inch of radius, so a log 2 feet through the middle carries something around 480 of them, and even at the coarser end of what those mills were running, 300 years is ordinary and 400 is not rare. A tree cut in 1891 with 400 rings started growing before the Mayflower, before Jamestown, before any European had seen the interior of this continent, and it spent the whole of that time standing in one place, putting on a fraction of a millimetre a year. Now put the second number against it: rotation. A rotation is the interval between planting a stand and harvesting it, and for pine on cut-over land in that region managed for timber, the working figure is something on the order of 50 to 80 years. 50 to 80, against 200 to 400. The forest they were cutting could not be regrown inside the planning horizon of any business, any government, any career, or any human life. And the difference is not a matter of degree, it is a factor of 4 or 5. And here is the part that stops it being an abstraction, because it is the same fact from the other end. The second growth stand, grown in the open on a short rotation, is a different material. 8 rings to the inch instead of 40 means wide bands of soft early wood, coarse grain, more knots because a tree grown in the open keeps its lower branches, and lumber that is less stable and weaker in the same dimension. You cannot buy that first board anymore at any price, because the thing that made it was not the tree. It was 2 centuries of closed canopy standing over the tree, and closed canopy is exactly what the operation removed. The foreman leaning over a log end in 1891 was not looking at old wood. He was looking at a manufacturing process that had run for 300 years and had just been switched off. What replaced the forest was a landscape with a name, and the name was the cutover. Millions of acres of stumps and slash across the northern counties of 3 states, sold to immigrant farmers as agricultural opportunity on soils that were never going to carry a farm, and a generation later, much of it came back to the counties as tax-delinquent land nobody wanted. Then there was fire. Logging slash dries into fuel, and the fires it produced were not ordinary forest fires. Peshtigo, in Wisconsin, on the 8th of October 1871, killed somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500 people in a matter of hours, and remains the deadliest fire in the country's history. And it is almost unknown, because Chicago burned the same night. Michigan burned that same day. Hinckley, Minnesota, in 1894, took several hundred more. These were not acts of God. They were a byproduct of a method, and the method was to take the trunk and leave everything else lying where it fell. And what stands there now is second growth on a short rotation, plus a very small number of preserved fragments, the Hartwick pines in Michigan, a few stands in Wisconsin, the Lost 40 in Minnesota, which survived because of a surveying error that put it underwater on the plat map, so nobody bought it and nobody cut it. Something under 1% of the original pine forest is still standing, and the largest single preserved tract in Michigan runs to a few dozen acres, which is to say that what remains of the greatest softwood forest on the continent would fit inside a medium-sized farm. And if you want to see what those log ends look like, you can, because the wood itself outlasted the forest. The joists, the floors, the studs and the trim of nearly every building put up in the Midwest in that era are full of it, and salvage crews now pull 130-year-old beams out of demolished factories and sell them at a premium, precisely because nothing being cut today has that grain. Which leaves one honest question, and it is not about the trees. So let me be straight, because this is where I stop narrating. I cannot give you a foreman's name, and I am not going to invent one. There is no famous quotation here, no single man who saw it first. And if somebody tells you the mills were hiding a secret, they are selling you something. This was not suppressed knowledge, it was distributed knowledge, held by thousands of people who each saw a piece of it, and none of whom were in a position where seeing it mattered. That is a different thing, and it is far more common than conspiracy, and it is the reason this story is worth 20 minutes, rather than the usual one. Nobody had to decide to bury anything. The knowledge simply had nowhere to go. The evidence was not hidden in an archive. It was on the end of every log, going through every mill on the Great Lakes, in plain sight, countable by anyone who leaned in with a lamp. And the men who counted it were correct. What they lacked was standing, and a channel, and a rule that would have made a slow cutter anything other than a bankrupt one. Being right was not the difficult part. Being right in a position where it counted was. When the institutions finally arrived, the Forest Service, the national forests, the state programs that spent the 20th century replanting those counties, they were built by people who had learned exactly the lesson the log ends had been teaching since the 80s. They were simply about 40 years behind the saw. And you can still check the arithmetic yourself. Find a floor joist in an old Midwestern building, put a light across the end grain at an angle, and count. If you get to 40 in an inch, you are holding 2 centuries of a forest that took 10,000 years to assemble and about 50 to remove, and the man who cut it knew what he was looking at, and told anyone who would listen, and it changed nothing at all.